Welcome back, you filthy exiles. Now, PoE has a number of league mechanics, and we already know that GGG will be porting and reworking many over into PoE 2 that will hopefully come out on release in the open beta in November. But the big question here is which mechanics should make their way into PoE 2 first? The following list I've put together will cover 4 mechanics I think should be ported into PoE 2 on launch, why I think they would make for engaging content for players, and for content that would fit into the theme of PoE 2 being a little bit slower and very vile and demonic in nature as well, from what I've seen so far of all the footage that's been released. So I will preface that while mapping is a mechanic, it's not specifically a league mechanic. It's sort of just the standard endgame grind, and so we're not going to put something that's superfluous in this list, just to clarify as well before we get into the video in great detail. Okay, so Incursion. Now, during Incursion, players will encounter Alva, a historian who has the ability to take the players back in time to an ancient temple in the past called the Temple of Atsuatl. And I'm surprised I can pronounce that word, but I did, and it's even 10 o'clock at night. In the temple, players must make a series of choices about which rooms to unlock and explore with various strategic unlocks that can generally only be accessed from the chambers within the temple. For example, Val corruption chambers, which allow players to double corrupt their items. And this would be, whether or not double corruption exists in PoE 2 is soon to be seen, but this could take the form of something else and could also allow for players to get access to very specific and targeted content that you wouldn't be able to access anywhere else, which is sort of in the theme of the way that PoE 2 is being developed, that each piece of content will be targetable and will have specific outcomes that can't be achieved anywhere else. Now, further to this, players must plan their route carefully to maximize their rewards within the temple, with the final goal being to defeat the boss at the very end of the incursion called the Val Omnitech. I think this mechanic sits well in the theme of PoE 2 based on the types of bosses and enemies so far we've seen in all the gameplay footage that GGG's released, as well as the theme of PoE 2 being very Val and Aztecian in nature, which fits into the whole architect or Omnitech sort of theme as well from Incursion. Also, Incursion generally in the PoE 1 game forces the player to make strategic choices around their gameplay, i.e. which rooms they want to select based on the outcomes they're seeking, and this also may allow for this type of gameplay in PoE 2, which is what PoE 2 sort of is taking the form of, as well as it would allow for character development because of target-only content being gated in the Incursion content, which would give the player access to only upgrades that you could only get from playing that mechanic and specific formats, and or making strategic decisions within that content to be able to access certain items and drops. This mechanic also plays well with a slower pace of gameplay, and in fact, when PoE 1 was a little bit slower, this was one of the older mechanics in PoE 1 that did slow the player pace down, and I'm not against this at all. Having a slower pace and being forced to make more meaningful and impactful decisions seems to be the theme of PoE 2, and this content very much would allow for that to be achieved. Okay, so Expedition is the second one that I'd say would be a really good piece of content to carry into PoE 2. We already know that Danik and his crew will be contained within PoE 2 and are part of the NPCs that assist the player through the story campaign, though their full involvement in the story isn't really totally clear yet because we simply just haven't seen enough and we don't know much about the story at this stage. Now, in PoE 1, Expeditions put the player in the position of mining out marked areas with dynamite and excavating the loot that lives below the surface. Though in the process of doing this, it also shakes up some pretty unforgiving enemies, as well with some interesting interactions such as ward defenses and such. Now, ward didn't really take off in PoE 1, but potentially in PoE 2, ward might actually be a legitimate defense that we don't really know about yet, though we do know the gearing sort of errs into the original formats of evasion, armor, and energy shield, which we've seen in PoE 1. So potentially ward could be a really niche mechanic, but the game would be more designed around it if it was included. So coming back to the fact that PoE 2 will be a much slower pace of gameplay than PoE 1, it's very likely that the Expedition mechanic could be reworked to accommodate for this particular playstyle. In more specifics, it would allow for GGG to create a mechanic that would allow the player to strategically place dynamite on nodes that would be specifically beneficial to the player, but also generate a bit of a risk for reward effect as well. I would assume this was the original idea behind why GGG put the mechanic in PoE 1, but didn't really execute really well because of the power creep in the game as it currently is. But in PoE 2, this could be relatively easily achieved because it is a much slower playstyle and it does require a little bit more thinking behind how you're going to play your build, as well as a lot more skill and reaction time to particular enemies on the field, as what we've seen so far. The other big comment I'd make here around Expedition is it was well received by the community when it was released in the PoE 1 and would make sense that it would be released in the PoE 2 with relatively positive feedback from PoE 2 players, and also they've already included the NPC, so it just makes sense that it would make its way into PoE 2 in some form or another. Okay, so the next piece of content I think may make its way back into PoE 2 from PoE 1 is Scourge, or Beyond League. It later got converted to Beyond. It was originally released as Scourge, but Beyond was dated and came out in one of the first 5 leagues of the game. And so I think that was under Sacrifice of the Val, which was actually the first league of the game, I think, from memory. And so it would make sense that they would have a bit of I guess, walk down memory lane and re-release some of the earliest content back into PoE 2 in a revamped format, very similar to Scourge as they had done in PoE 1. Now, personally, I really like Scourge. I thought it was a fantastic league. It was obviously later replaced the Beyond mechanic in PoE 1, which I have no negative comments about. I think Beyond was outdated and sometimes extremely rippy and unbalanced. And Scourge is really cool. Like, you have demons spawning up out of the ground attacking you, and you've got these big, ridiculous bosses or mini bosses that spawn up mid-map that are just absolutely crazy. And I think this is part of the reason why this would be a really good mechanic for GGG to put back into the game in PoE 2. The way that I see that this could be done is simply GGG alluding to the fact that the player will have to fight old foes, and it would sort of warp to another dimension or a Val dimension where the enemies start to become alive and triggered by something that's happened in the PoE 2 world, and also allude to the fact that at the end of the events of PoE 1, the player had defeated the Scourge, forever being locked in its realm, never to be released again. And it would seem like a bittersweet irony with everything kicking up in PoE 2 that the Scourge be re-released upon the realm of Rayclast and wreak havoc all over again. And I really think they could come up with some absolutely nightmare-fueled stuff to put into the game to tackle the player and also keep you up at night, which would be amusing because some of the Scourge enemies are absolutely terrifying. Now, as far as the Scourge bosses from PoE 1, like, they're pretty menacing as they are and can really smash players into the dirt. And I think this would also allow for some really interesting and challenging late game mapping interactions in PoE 2 without having to increase the extent of the number of maps or the craziness of, like, the bosses in the PoE 1 maps are very likely absolutely off the chain. They're most likely going to be reported out of the main game and juiced up based on the map mods. But having mini bosses within the map based on a game that's a much slower and strategic gameplay would seem like a really cool interaction where you have to fight a series of mini bosses before you even get to the main boss, just like a cabal of, you know, Scourge bosses being thrown at you, and not to mention all the ads and everything that's being thrown at you in the meantime. Now, as far as the loot drops that could come from the Scourge mechanic, not currently, it's really fringe currency in PoE 1, so it's the tainted currency that drops from it, which allows you to work with corrupted items and whatnot. And I think this is an opportunity for GGG to basically recraft that into something really cool, because a lot of those currencies, such as fusings and whatnot, won't be making their way back into PoE 2 potentially in the very end of it all. So it could allow GGG to come up with ways to have very specific loot drops come from those particular bosses if you so choose to tackle them, so risk versus reward again. And also on top of that, they could encompass things with the way that itemization works in PoE 2, whereby skills are appended into items in the implicit socket. You could actually sort of come up with a case where there could be tainted skills or like skills that can't be obtained anywhere else in the game without taking on this content. So tainted skills that have very unique interactions, And that could be a really cool concept that GGG could work with. So you actually have to farm the content and then juice it up in a very specific way to get access to a very specific drop, or a specific boss within the Scourge content drops a very specific item with a very specific skill that can only be obtained from that content. And this sort of plays into the way that GGG is setting PoE 2 up, where it has very target farmable content. And so this mechanic would allow for that to be achieved to a certain degree. And I think it's just overall a really engaging piece of content. And it also doesn't force the player into having to play the content. They could choose to natively play it in line with their mapping, or choose not to play it, depending on the level to which their character's geared. And I think that's something that the PoE community really likes, is having options and not being forced in the position of having to do something they may not want to do. But I do think that this would be really engaging content to make its way into PoE 2 upon release, and realistically would make a lot of sense because it's not a heavily pervasive piece of content either. It's sort of natively sort of baked into mapping, as mapping being the conduit to which this content is carried in and to which the enemies are spawned within to attack the player. Now, obviously, the fourth mechanic I will mention here is Delve, because number one, Delve is the greatest. And also at ExileCon and some of the interviews, and as well as some of the press release content that's come around, there was a bit of an alluding to the fact that Soulfight would still be in the game in some form. So I'm going to take that as Delve confirmed, 100%. But on a serious note, Delve could be something really special in PoE 2. For those who don't know what Delve is, it's an infinite loot dungeon, which has the character interact with an NPC called Nico to essentially delve into the depths of the mines under Ray class looking for loot and treasure. As far as what could be done with this mechanic in PoE 2, it already hosts a number of unique bosses in PoE 1 that are inaccessible in any other piece of content in the game, and to which have unique targetable loot drops that can only be accessed in Delve in PoE 1, being items such as the All's Uprising or Curiosity of the Veil drops or Precursor rings, which are really cool. The mine mechanic itself essentially can host any form of content, and Delve has an ever-increasing level of difficulty which would allow players to challenge themselves at deeper depths, and this is exactly what happens in PoE 1, but we've got builds that sort of cheese their way into Delve, whereas in PoE 2, it could be a very skill-based level of progression in Delve. So not just building a uber tank that can just face everything and destroy the world, but having a character that has a blend of mechanics that allows it to evade and dodge and or potentially face tank very specific mechanics, but also would allow for the player to apply a skill-based progression as opposed to just having a juicy character that you've pumped 20 mirrors into. I think this is a real sort of opportunity for GGG to make Delve something absolutely crazy, and also take it away from being like a 1% player base sort of mechanic and move it into anyone can achieve the lower steps as long as you're good enough at the game. I also think it allows the opening up of very farmable or target farmable content in the game. So the Delve nodes could be very specific in many more ways than one. You could have very specific items or base types or whatnot that only drop in Delve that the player would have to hunt or seek out in order to complete their builds. And so this is going to give a lot more player longevity or game longevity for the, I guess, character that players are playing with, and it's going to give people the ability to target things and work towards things, which is sort of in line again with the ethos behind the way that PoE 2 is being developed. I also just think Delve is great, and it's my favorite mechanic, and I'll be really disappointed if it doesn't come out in the first like 6 months of PoE 2 coming out, because I think things like the Templar and Flail builds and things like that could be absolutely crazy in Delve, and even monks and whatnot that are high mobility characters. We may see a return of ZHP characters that are solely based on agility reflexes and or clutch playstyles, and I think that's absolutely fantastic, as well as environmental effects and whatnot could be really cool in Delve as well. There's just so many possibilities for builds with the new way that the game's being designed that Delve could just be absolutely wild at deeper depths, and you'll see absolutely insane ways of gameplay when players are versing things that can absolutely just blow wind at them and one-tap them and destroy them if one mistake's made. And I think you'll see like a new generation of clutch plays come out in Deep Delve if it makes its way back into PoE 2. So overall, there is no real way to know at this stage what will be making its way into PoE 2 first. It's all speculation at this point until it's confirmed. But feel free to post below with your ideas and speculations. I think the release of PoE 2 looming is really exciting because it's an opportunity to clear the slate. And so far we know so little about the game and what to expect. And this makes it fun to imagine what could be in a few months' time. Anyway, if you like this type of content, don't forget to like and sub to the channel and follow the Twitch. I stream on there quite often. I am working away at the moment, so I'm trying to make content and stream. It's been a little bit hard. I'll be creating plenty more PoE 2 content moving forwards as well, because I'm really excited about PoE 2, and I'm definitely going to be working to make builds in PoE 2 when it first comes out. In particular, this channel is going to be specializing in tanks, and hopefully 2-button builds. And as we get closer to the release date, I'll also be looking for as much information as I can get to sort of break it apart and create some real no frills, no BS content that everybody can enjoy. And also maybe some speculation around what could be at the end of the day, like videos like this. That all being said, have a good one, and I'll see you guys later.